One of the armies that is in the order category that I always kind of think feels a bit weird is up next. It is time for the Daughters of Khaine, the rather bloodthirsty and often just plain unpleasant faction of murderers and killers. They are led by one of the absolute coolest god beings in all of Age of Sigmar, who is Morathi, and in their new faction pack, they have still got some unbelievably speedy and lethal tricks to bring to the battlefields of 4th edition. Now, the Daughters of Khaine still have their set of battle traits that we know from 3rd edition, really, where they get a growing cumulative set of effects in the form of their blood rites, and these gain you a new set of buffs that all stack from battle rounds 1 to 5. They are all pretty much the same as we know from the previous edition, apart from the last one, and they go in order of +1 to run rolls in battle round 1 thanks to quickening bloodlust, and then the next one that gets added onto that at the start of the next battle round is headlong fury, which gives your units +1 to charge rolls. Then as we move into battle round 3, you get Zealot's Rage, which gives you +1 to hit rolls. After that, it is Slaughterer's Wound, which gets you +1 to wound rolls. And then finally, as you go into battle round 5, you no longer get the 5-up ward from Unquenchable Fervor. Instead, this 5th round rule is called Frenzied Worshippers, which is a more offensive focused one, giving you +1 attack. So in battle round 5, your entire army can be +1 to run, +1 to charge, +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and with +1 attacks. So those last couple of turns can just be unbelievably brutal for your opponent. There is also a once per battle ability that costs you a command point, but all out slaughter is back, and instead of giving a unit exploding 6s, it now lets you pick an infantry unit to receive the command, and they can essentially fight twice in that turn, albeit they do have strike last for their second activation. So your units, especially in the later battle rounds, can get potentially 2 massive sets of devastating attacks into an enemy unit. And in all likelihood, they will pretty much kill anything they come up against in the last couple of turns of the game. So they really are some solid battle traits. They do lean into this glass cannon idea of the army. You are super fast and you are super hard hitting. You have, however, kept your 6-up ward in most cases from Fanatical Faith. It has just been put into the warscrolls as a keyword, so you haven't lost all of your durability. There is a little bit of extra protection on most of your units as well. In terms of your formations, they no longer get you a way to boost the blood rites up a bit faster like you could with one of the sub-factions in 3rd edition. Instead, the 4 that we get do some other helpful things. Scath Coven brings you the speed of the Scathborn, which means if you make a charge roll of 8+ for a Melusai or khinerai unit, they get strike first for the turn, which can be very potent to get the absolute most out of those buffs you will have in the later stages of the game, and make sure that you don't lose a load of models from enemy attacks before you may get to swing. It is only on an 8+, which is a shame, so it isn't super reliable, but it is still quite a nice one to have if you are going in heavy on those sorts of units. The Shadow Patrol nets you the Shadow Paths rule, which is in your movement phase, you can roll a dice, and on a 3+, you can pick an infantry unit and remove them from the board before setting them back up 9 inches from enemies. So again, it's just a really nice, speedy mobility tool for getting a unit around the board onto an objective, or either closer or further away from an enemy unit. And then of course, when you get into battle round 2, your army has that +1 to charge. So you could set up a unit and get the still not guaranteed, but much easier 8-inch charge instead of the 9. Frenzied Devotees is the rule for the Cauldron Guard. This is once per turn. At the end of any turn, it allows you to pick 3 infantry or war machine units that are in combat, and they can each make a pile-in move, and then you pick an enemy unit in combat with them and you roll a d3, and on a 2+, they do that much mortal damage to them. So it is just some extra mortal damage output each turn, as well as potentially a bonus little pile-in to either get more bodies onto an objective or just get yourself into a better position for a follow-up move or charge in a subsequent turn. So again, a really nice, solid, useful mobility tool for your army. And then finally, we have the Slaughter Troop and the Gladiatorial Acrobatics. This is a reaction after you have declared a charge with an elf unit, so things like your Witch Elves. You can turn one of the dice rolled for your charge to a 4. So this gets you a minimum of a 5, even if you rolled a double 1, but it can net you a much nicer average roll of around 8 or so it can make it just that much more likely for you to make a charge into a unit that is maybe slightly further away than you would like, or just give you that reassurance that you can't possibly fail a 3 or a 5-inch charge, which in a dice rolling game is a really nice thing to have. Then of course we get to the usual 3 traits and artifacts that we've come to expect. There is 1 passive on the traits and then 2 that are at the end of any turn. The first is the Master of Poisons, which I really love. This lets you at the end of any turn pick an enemy unit that you've done any damage to that turn by combat attacks, and then for the rest of the battle they can't heal or return models to their unit. This is insanely fun and insanely powerful against some armies. Death armies or demon armies who rely a lot on that ability to bring things back will hate this. No more skeletons or zombies or bloodletters being brought back to a unit is a huge part of how those armies play. So this is going to absolutely decimate their ability to really play their army to their strengths. And I think this is just a genuine winner in terms of the traits in this book. The Bathed in Blood trait is also at the end of any turn. This one just heals you 3 if you're in combat. So on a slightly tankier unit that will survive a round of combat, this can be really good, making it much harder for your opponent to chip you down, because you will be getting back a guaranteed 3 health every single turn. So they will essentially need to kill you in one go, or you can just get back up to your full wounds very quickly. The final one is the passive of Zealous Orator. This is one we've seen before, but is the very handy roll 3 extra dice when you use the rally command on a unit wholly within 12 inches of the hero. So still pretty solid and can help your units just stick around and keep fighting that much longer. So I would say all of these are good. I think the Master of Poisons and the Bathed in Blood are my favorite though, and I would say they are both incredibly good, strong buffs to bring. On the artifact front, there is a very nice one potentially with the Khainite Pendant. This is once per battle, but in your hero phase, you can give a friendly priest wholly within 12 inches of the bearer d6 ritual points. So this can be done to very reliably get a prayer off straight away if you need it, whilst most armies will need to bank that first set of ritual points and aim to get their prayers off in battle round 2. You do actually have a reasonably good chance of getting a prayer off and up and running straight away with this artifact alongside your regular prayer roll. So if you do have a particular prayer that you want to get off as soon as humanly possible and get things running, this could be almost a must-take artifact. The Sevenfold Shadow is another once per battle. This is in your movement phase. It lets you remove the bearer and set them up again 9 inches from enemies. So again, just a helpful little movement tool to either get them near a unit they need to support, or to get a charge off, or to just bait and switch an enemy that may have been gunning for them. It's possibly a bit niche, but if you plan around it, it can be very powerful. And then finally, you also have the passive Crown of Woe. This is like we've seen in other armies. It plays into the objective game. It lets you reduce control for enemy units by 2 when they are within 9 inches. So it's another good way to get a hero up close and into combat and make it that much harder for the enemy to actually score points. I would say they're all okay, but personally I like the Khainite Pendant the most. I just think it is a really useful one, and if you are sort of playing an army that relies on a lot of prayers, it is, as I said, maybe going to be mandatory in a lot of situations. Before we get onto the prayers themselves though, we do have the spell and manifestation lore. The spell lore is the Lore of Shadows, with some familiar spells if you ever played fantasy. Steed of Shadows casts on a 5+ and allows a unit wholly within 12 inches of the caster to charge even if they have run that turn. So in battle round 2, potentially run and charge with +1 to both rolls gets you an average of around 12 or 13 inches, which on top of your movement could make for an incredibly zippy little unit. Doomfire is your more damaging spell. It's cast on a 7+, so it's a little bit trickier to cast, but this lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches and you do D3 mortal damage if the target has less than 10 models, D6 mortal damage if the unit has 10 to 19 models, and a flat 6 mortal damage if the enemy unit has 20 or more models. So it's a bit different to the standard roll a dice for each model in a unit and do a mortal damage on a 5 or 6. And generally with average rolling in that situation, you will get around 6 or 7 mortal damage on those other types of spells. But those other ones can of course potentially spike a lot higher or lower. So this one is maybe a bit more reliable, but I would say on average it's probably going to be worse, to be honest. I think the D3 and D6 damage against the lower model count units are worse compared to rolling for each model separately, and whilst the flat guaranteed 6 is nice against units of 20, again you can spike the other versions much higher, and I just think it's also more fun to be rolling 20 dice into a big unit to see how much damage you do. So I don't know, this one feels like a bit of a miss to me, and I think most other armies have got a better version of it as a horde clearing ability. Finally though, you also have Mindrazor. This is cast on a whopping 8+, so it is quite challenging to get off, but this lets you pick a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches and you get +1 rend to their weapons, but on top of that, if the unit charges, they also get +1 damage. So again, to go back to battle round 5, this could net you a unit that has +1 to run, charge, hit, wound, and attacks, and also +1 rend and +1 damage, which is frankly absurd. It is horrendous the amount of damage they can do, and if you did manage to get this all off and charge into something, you would pretty much kill basically anything in the game with like 20 witch elves with all of these buffs up. The manifestations are cast on either a 5 or a 6, and again we will look at those in just a little bit later on in the video, but onto the prayer lore, there are some very good ones here. The Sacrament of Blood is chanted on a 5+, and if you get it off you add 1 to the current battle round number for the blood rites on a unit that you pick wholly within 12 inches of the priest, and if you cast this on a 10+, or you chant this should I say, on a 10+, you instead just put it straight up to battle round 5 for that unit. So with the Khainite Pendant, you could theoretically get that buffed up version turn 1. It would be a bit hard, but it is possible, and get a unit that has got all of those amazing buffs in the very first battle round. But I mean, even if you don't get that, just getting the extra +1 to run and charge rolls in battle round 1 could make for a unit that is really good, and getting those bonuses a little bit quicker will always be a welcome thing to have. The Martyr's Sacrifice is chanted on a much easier 4+, and so with the pendant this is almost guaranteed to go off turn 1. Again, it lets you pick a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches, and if a model in that unit dies in combat, you can roll a dice when they die, and on a 5+, you do a mortal damage back to the enemy. So this is almost like a little explosion of blood to hurt the enemy as they kill you. And then if you chant this on an 8+, you instead roll 2 dice, so double the chance of doing some mortals back into an enemy that killed you. The final prayer is the Covenant of the Iron Heart. This is again chanted on either a 4+ or an 8+ for the boosted version. This allows a unit wholly within 12 inches to ignore modifiers to their control score until the next turn. So if you know an enemy has some debuffs that could impact you, this can help you keep control of that key objective. And then if you chant this on an 8+, you actually also add 5 to the unit's control score. So it will make it even easier for you to take and hold objectives from bigger enemy units or enemies with a big control score like monsters. So this is again a really solid prayer, and once again with something like the Khainite Pendant, very, very reliable if you wanted to try and get this off battle round 1. So there are just a really great set of spells and some solid prayers to really help boost your army into the absolute stratosphere. But what about the war scrolls themselves? Well, let's begin with the Snake Queen herself, Morathi Khaine, and her alter ego, the Shadow Queen. So Morathi Khaine is now a whopping 760 points, up 80 points from her 3rd edition 680. And as mentioned, she does still have the same dual style profile with the Shadow Queen. Morathi Khaine still has her 6 health, but now only a 5 up save instead of a 4 up, and also now has a combined set of attacks from her Heartrender and Wings, which are 5 attacks in total that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 2 rend and 2 damage. So it is quite a drop from her old profile, which had 9 attacks in total and wounded on 3s. She is a 3 cast wizard though, which is fantastic, and she does still have that 6 up ward for protection. She also gets +1 to cast with Sorceress Supreme and her own spell in Mirror Dance, which is cast on a 7 and lets you put 2 tokens on the battlefield, one underneath her and then the other underneath the Shadow Queen's model, and they can essentially swap places. So it's a really cheeky way to either get Morathi out of trouble and instead drop the much more terrifying Shadow Queen right into the enemy's place, or just if you need to get a spell off on a particular unit that wasn't in range but was in range of the Shadow Queen, you can do that to swap things around. So it is just really good and really handy to get either of those models exactly where you need them to be. Her final rule is directly related to her other form. 1 soul, 2 bodies is her rule that means that whenever this model takes any damage, you instead allocate it to the Shadow Queen. And if this model would be automatically destroyed by something like a spell or an ability, then instead you just allocate 3 damage to the Shadow Queen, and then if the Shadow Queen is destroyed, this unit is also immediately destroyed too. So with that in mind, we may as well move straight onto the Shadow Queen, who is the much scarier melee beat stick of the 2 models. The Shadow Queen has 12 health and a 12-inch move, backed up by a 4-up save and a 6-up ward. She is a monster and she can fly, which is really good, and then she also has some unbelievably good attacks. Her Gaze of the Shadow Queen is only 1 attack, but 2s and 2s, 3 rend and d6 damage is pretty fantastic, to be honest, and pretty reliable even with just 1 attack. But then in melee she's even better. She still has her 3 weapons with Heartrender, the Crown of Serpents and her Envenomed Tail. Heartrender is always 8 attacks now, and it hits and wounds on 3s with 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, so that alone will do about 8 damage into a 4-up save enemy, which is fantastic. But if you need even more pain, she also gets 2d6 attacks from her crown. Now these only hit and wound on 4s with no rend and 1 damage, but they are a nice little way to help clear out a unit of chaff that may be trying to tie her up a bit better. And then she has a really scary anti-monster style attack with her tail. It is only 1 attack, but 3s and 3s with 2 rend and a flat 6 damage will net you around a 35% chance to get through a 4-up save and just do a whopping 6 damage into something like an enemy monster or a unit of infantry. So she is very, very killy, and if she gets into combat, she is going to wipe out pretty much anything that she hits, especially when some of those battle trait bonuses get rolling. Her unique rules also add some fantastic durability to her. She can only take a maximum of 3 damage points per turn, and any more after that are just ignored. So she can't die. She literally cannot die in your games until turn 2 of Battle Round 2 at the earliest, which means you can just be so much more confident that she will be able to get around the board and do what you need her to do without dying before she can really do anything. It doesn't make her invincible, and you still do need to be careful with her, but the fact that she can only take a quarter of her health in damage each turn is unbelievably strong. She also gets a rampage in Fury of the Shadow Queen, which lets her in any combat phase pick an enemy she's in combat with and roll a d3, and then on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage. And if she kills any models with this, you also get to add 1 to the attacks for any khinerai or Melusai units wholly within 12 inches of her for the turn. So her rampage can do a tiny bit of damage itself, but also potentially be a really good buff move for the units around her. So I would say she is pricey, but she is really durable, really killy, and a really good wizard too for the Morathi part of her. So I would say she is still one of the better god units in my opinion. Up next, we have a new unit which came in the Dawnbringer series, Krathusa the Croneseer. She is 190 points and she gets you a 1-chant priest with 6 health, a 5-up save and a 6-up ward, as well as a 12-inch move and fly, so she is pretty mobile. In melee, she's pretty mediocre. She's got 4 attacks, which are 3s and 4s with 1 rend and d3 damage, but that isn't really why she's here. She's got her own prayer, which is chanted on a 4+, and what Murder of Crows lets you do is you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and you either roll a d3 or a d6 if you chanted on an 8+, and you do that much mortal damage to the enemy unit. But then on top of that, if your roll is higher than the enemy's health characteristic, the target is also -1 to hit until your next turn. So this is a very, very good chant. Getting that 8+ can be done in a couple of turns, and then you can very easily do a solid 3 or 4 mortal damage to an enemy unit, and then make even scarier elite units -1 to hit for a turn, with the ability to make them -1 to hit if you roll over their health characteristic. So it is quite a useful little ability. She also gets the Burnt Offerings rule, which is in any hero phase. If she is within combat range of a Cauldron of Blood, you can do this. You pick a friendly non-hero infantry elf unit wholly within 18 inches, and you roll a dice, and on a 2+, you can choose from one of 3 effects. Either Prophecy of Silence, which makes it so enemy units in combat with the target can't use commands, Prophecy of Dark Wings, which gives the unit a free normal move, but they do count as having run that turn, but is still potentially a bigger or at least more reliable run move. Or you can do Prophecy of Reclamation, which makes enemy units that aren't monsters or heroes have 10 less control if they are contesting the same objective as your target unit. So 3 really good little techie abilities there, and I think for her 190 points, yes, she's not the most damaging unit, but she isn't a bad pick to add some utility to your force, as well as a nice little bit of damage and further debuffs from Murder of Crows. Now we move on to a war machine. The Bloodrack Shrine is 240 points, which is a hefty 80 points more than it was in 3rd edition. It has also lost a health, dropping to just 12, but it does now have a better save with a 4-up instead of a 5+. It also has a 6-inch move rather than degrading down to 3, and it still has the shooting attack in the Bloodrack Stare, which has a 12-inch range that hits on 2s, and then if it does hit, you roll a number of dice equal to the models in the target unit, and on a 5+, you do a mortal damage. So this is again a really, really nice reliable way to do potentially a huge amount of damage onto an enemy unit, and as ever being able to do on average nearly 6 or 7 mortal damage to a 20 strong enemy blob is just a great use of this war machine. In melee, it's also still pretty decent. It's got 5 attacks that are 3s and 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and then 6 additional from its goad staves, which are 3s and 4s but no rend and 1 damage. So it's not super killy, but it does have a decent number of attacks, and 5 of them are reasonably okay. On top of that, it also has a hero phase ability with Aura of Agony. This lets you pick up to 3 enemy units within 9 inches of it in your hero phase, and you roll a d3, and you do mortal damage on a 2+. So it's a really good piece for ruining a castled up enemy's day. And then in the charge phase, if this unit charged, you can pick a unit within 1 inch and you roll a d3, and on a 2+ do that much mortal damage. So this thing can do a huge amount of mortal damage over the course of a turn. And then on top of that, it is also a 1-cast wizard. So yes, it is pricey at 240 points, but I actually think it's really good. It can definitely make its points back reasonably quite quickly with all of the mortal damage output, and especially with the Bloodrack Stare. One of the non-named heroes is next with the Melusai Iron Scale. She is still 6 health with a 5-up save and a great 8-inch move. She has also gone up 40 points. She has, on top of that, lost an attack on her ranged weapon, but it is now D3 damage instead of just 1, so I would say overall maybe a slight improvement there. And then in melee, she's gained 3 attacks and is a more reliable flat 2 damage instead of D3, but she now only wounds on 4s instead of 3s. I would say overall, she is probably a little bit better and certainly more reliable into most enemies. She brings along a brilliant re-roll charges passive for friendly Melusai units wholly within 12 inches of her, thanks to the Wrath of the Scathborn, and then she can use a rather tasty reaction in Gory Offering, which is done when you fight with her. You can then pick a non-hero Melusai unit within combat range of her, and they can fight immediately afterwards. So it is just the nice, reliable double activation. The unit you choose also gets +1 attack on their melee weapons though when they do this, which can make some of your Melusai units really quite scary into an enemy unit. Another hero you have access to is the Hag Queen on the Cauldron of Blood. This unit has again gone up quite a lot. She is now 350 points, up from 270, but has, like the Shrine, gained a 4-up save at the expense of 1 health, dropping to 12 health as well. The Torrent of Burning Blood is the same profile and range as it was before, but her melee has changed a bit, mostly for the better. The Avatar's Sword is now an extra attack and still 2 rend and 3 damage, which is really, really good. Her Blade of Khaine has dropped to only wounding on 4s, but gained a more reliable 2 damage instead of D3, and also gained the crit mortal rule. So I would say that is better overall. And then her Skiansa is now always 6 attacks rather than going from 8 down to 5, and is the same 3s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage. So I would say overall she is a bit better in melee, and she is also a priest who can chant once, so there is that extra little bit of utility there as well. In terms of rules, the Altar of Khaine passive gives +1 to save rolls for friendly infantry units wholly within 9 inches, and also +1 to chant rolls for friendly priests wholly within 9 inches. So this will make your own chanting better too for this unit, which is really good. The Bladed Impact rule is still a form of impact hit, letting you roll a d3 after you've charged and on a 2+, doing that much mortal damage to an enemy unit within 1 inches. And then finally, the Witch Brew is your any hero phase ability. It lets you pick a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches, and you give them a 5-up ward if you roll a 3+ for the turn. So it's not always going to go off, but it is a decent boost to your unit's durability, and alongside the other tricks the Hag Queen can do, this can make your army a bit more durable and a bit punchier too. So I would say overall it's not bad, she is just very, very pricey. One of the coolest models in the AOS range is up next. The Bloodrack Medusa is an awesome little murder wizard. She's 6 health with a 5-up save and has the same Bloodrack stare as the Shrine, doing a load of mortals on a 5+ to bigger enemy units. In melee, she also has her Spear and Claw, which brings her 5 attacks which hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage. So it is a bit worse compared to her 3rd edition profile, with between 8 and 13 attacks. But she also gets to pick a non-hero Melusai unit within her combat range, and after she's fought, they can fight immediately. So that is pretty useful. Overall, I do really like the model, and I do really like her. She has jumped, however, 50 points all the way to 180, so that is quite a hefty increase. But she is also a 1-cast wizard, so that does go a little bit of a way to adding some more usability on top of her frankly amazing anti-horde shooting attack. The generic Hag Queen is still a fairly squishy 5 health and 5-up save, but is now a 1-chant priest, which can add a lot of value to her. She's moderately killy with 4 attacks on 3s and 4s, 1 rend and 2 damage, and crit mortals, which is nice. And then she has the Witch Brew rule, like the earlier version we just saw, which lets you give a unit a 5-up ward on a 3+, which can again make her a really nice supporting and buff piece. She has gone up a little bit, but only 30 points. She's now 140 points. So if you are running a lot of Witch Elves, I do still think she is definitely a rather good pick to bring alongside them. Next up, we have a unit that, unlike their 40k version, isn't anywhere near as good. The Avatar of Khaine is a monster with 7 health and a 3-up save, which isn't awful for AOS, but it has now only got a 6-inch move instead of a 9-inch, so it is much slower. As we've seen in a couple of earlier units, the Torrent of Burning Blood and the Avatar's Sword are pretty much the same, with just 1 extra attack on the sword And then the rampage for this thing is the Wrath of Khaine, which lets you in any charge phase roll a d3 and do that much mortal damage on a 2+ to an enemy within 1 inches. But if the target is a monster, you do double the damage. So potentially up to 6 mortal damage into an enemy monster in the charge phase, which, let's be honest, isn't too awful. Like everything else though, it has had a hefty points bump though. It is now 190 points, and on top of that, it has also lost its 5-up ward, now only having a 6-up. So I'm really not sold on this thing, and I genuinely do think that just bringing the Altar of Khaine may be a better, if more expensive choice if you wanted to bring something like this along. Much like the Hag Queen, on the Cauldron of Blood we also got the Slaughter Queen. The main differences here are the 2 extra attacks on the Blade of Khaine thanks to the added Death Sword, although it does also lose the crit mortal rule to offset that. And then instead of a Witch Brew, it has Orgy of Slaughter, which is in any combat phase. You can pick an elf infantry unit wholly within 12 inches and they get +1 attacks on a 3+. So instead of the more defensive 5-up ward from the Hag Queen, this is your more offensive variant. Now they are both 350 points, so still both very, very pricey, but I guess it just depends if you want to get the most damage out of your Witch Elves, and if you do, this could be a relatively good buff piece to bring for them. Of course, the non-mounted Slaughter Queen also makes an appearance. Pretty much the same rules, just without the extra Blade of Khaine and Sciancer attacks, and then also, of course, being squishier with just 5 health and a 5-up save. She is 150 points, so she's a tiny bit pricier than the Hag Queen. And once again, it just depends if you want to go for the more defensive or the more offensive variant, as to which of the two you are likely going to want to bring. Next up, we have the slightly lesser hero of the High Gladiatrix. She is now 130 points rather than 90, so she has had a 40-point bump and has also lost a pip of health, dropping to just 5. She also has a combined profile with her Whip and Blade, which is 6 attacks in total, so the same as 3rd edition, but now 3s and 4s instead of 3s and 3s, but it is 2 damage now instead of 1. So it is a higher maximum ceiling, which is great. It is just a little bit harder for her to wound. She can also be a paragon of slaughter in any combat phase, which lets you give a friendly non-hero elf infantry unit wholly within 12 inches +1 rend on their weapons on a 2+, which is just brilliant for helping things like your Witch Elves get through tougher, better save units. And then she can also, once per battle, pick an enemy that she's in combat with and roll 2d6. And if you roll higher than their health, they are just dead. So like the similar rule we saw with the Idoneth, on an average of 2d6 being 7, things like Slaughter Priests, Vampire Lords, even things like the new Lord Veritant for the Stormcast will just get one shot. So this is plain scary. It's really good. It's a bit unreliable and it's a bit swingy, but this is a huge threat for those foot heroes that may have 5 or 6 or 7 health, because they could just get wiped out before they can do anything thanks to this ability. One of the scarier units from the Dark Elves of old Warhammer Fantasy also make a return, the Doomfire Warlocks. They, in terms of their models, have actually held up quite well for their age, I think, but they are now, I would say, just a moderately okay cavalry unit. 150 points gets you 5 of them with 3 health and a 5-up save profile and a 1-cast wizard. They do, however, have a fantastic 14-inch move. They can also always redeploy at least 4 inches even if you roll a 1 to 3, so they can avoid combat quite well if they need to, but they have unfortunately lost their unique Doomfire spell, which was a way for them to do a solid bit of damage to the enemy. They do still know the spell because it is part of the army spell lore, but they just don't have it on their profile anymore. They do, however, still keep their crossbows, which are kind of meh. They're a 10-inch range now, and they hit on 3s, win on 4s, rather than the other way round like they did in 3rd. And I would say overall they're just okay. They're a good mobile wizard, which could come in handy, but they basically don't do any damage otherwise. So you pretty much are just going to be using these still for just moving around and casting Doomfire. Up next, we have the Sisters of Slaughter with Sacrificial Knives. These are 1 health, 6 up save with a 6 up ward, so they are very much the definition of glass cannon, but with 3 attacks on 3s and 4s with 1 rend against infantry and 1 damage. They do just have a good weight of dice profile for 130 points, and they can also move 3 inches in the enemy combat phase to help them get a bit closer to a target that they want to fight, or just otherwise maybe make it a bit more difficult for an enemy to engage them, so they can be okay. You can instead though take the Sisters with Bladed Bucklers. They are a cheaper 110 points for 10, and they do have a better 5 up save, but they do lose an attack on an otherwise identical melee profile. I would say overall though they are better. They get the -1 to be hit from the Dance of Diversion passive, and they can also do some mortal damage back onto the enemy if they roll a saving throw of 6 thanks to their Bladed Bucklers. So I would say overall, thanks to being cheaper, more durable, and also not that much different from an output in terms of your damage perspective thanks to the Reflected Mortals, just makes them overall a much better pick for me. If you don't like the Sisters of Slaughter though, you could instead go for the Witch Elves, either with Bladed Bucklers for the same 5 up save and 2 attacks, but with the crit auto wound ability instead of +1 rend against infantry, and then the same reflecting mortals back to the enemy thanks to their Bladed Bucklers. They are also the same 110 points, which is nice if you are going up against monsters or cavalry if your opponent has a load of those. Otherwise, the more fighty Witch Elves are the ones with the paired Skiansas. They drop back to the 6 up save, but they gain an attack and do have the crit auto wound rule, and then they also get +1 rend if they've charged. So again, for 110 points, I would say both variants of the Witch Elves are probably better than the Sisters of Slaughter. Certainly if you want pure output, the Witch Elves with the paired Skiansas are better than the Sisters of Slaughter with the Sacrificial Knives, in my opinion. On to the more esoteric Daughters of Khaine units now. The Bloodstalkers are our first Melusai infantry unit with a very scary ranged profile. They have 3 shots at 18 inches that are 3s and 4s with 1 rend and 1 damage, and also auto wound on crits. So these are great for whittling down the enemy as they move towards you. They are pricey at 140 points for 5, but with 2 health and a 5 up save and a 6 up ward, that can keep them alive if you do manage to stay away from your opponent, which with their 8-inch move they can do quite well anyway. They can also use the Heartseekers rule, which is in your shooting phase. This lets them get crits on a 5+ if they haven't moved, so getting you about 5 damage into a 4 up save enemy each shooting phase, which is actually a pretty good profile for a ranged unit in 4th edition. The winged khinerai Heartrenders are up next with their solid 12-inch move and a fairly standard for the army 5 up save, but with 2 health they can stick around a bit longer. They come in a unit of 5 for 110 points, so 22 points per model, and they can do a little bit of shooting. They have 2 shots at 12 inches, which are 3s and 4s with 1 rend, 1 damage, and the crit auto wounds rule, so it's nothing amazing. But with their movement, they can be quite slippery, and they can also move after they've shot in the shooting phase with fire and flight, which lets them move d6 after shooting, so they can dive in, shoot, and then back away to get away from an enemy charge a bit more reliably. They can also deep strike in thanks to death from above, which lets them set up in your movement phase 9 inches from enemies if you have deployed them off the board using the circling in the skies above rule, so they can be very mobile and slippery and difficult to pin down, and put just some light pot shot style shooting into an opponent just to harass and annoy them. But now onto the melee versions of the 2 units. The Blood Sisters are the Melusai ones, with the same 2 health and 5 up save, but they are now more punchy in combat compared to the Bloodstalkers. Instead, they have 2 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and the crit mortals rule, which does make them fairly spicy. They also have the crystal touch rule, which has a chance to give an enemy unit strike last. In any combat phase, you roll a dice, and if the dice roll is higher than the target's health, then you inflict strike last on them. So they can usually fight pretty well into weaker infantry-sized units and get the damage into them before they can hit back, which does help them to dish out just the most amount of damage possible before they potentially get hit back and die. So for 140 points, they aren't bad, and they can be a relatively scary anti-infantry unit to throw into your opponent. The melee khinerai unit is called the Life Takers. They are just 100 points for 5, which is nice and cheap for that same 2 health and 5 up save, but their melee is a bit worse. They are still 2 attacks on 3s and 4s with 1 rend, but they are only 1 damage and the crit auto wound rule, which is okay but nothing super amazing. They can, like their ranged sisters, deep strike in from the skies, but their main rule is the reaction fight and flight. This lets you move d6 after using a fight ability. So someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that means you could charge these ladies in, fight with them, and then use this reaction to move out of combat and avoid any return swings from the enemy. That's how I'm reading it, and it does potentially make them again a unit that is very fast, very difficult to pin down, very slippery, and really good at using their abilities to make these hit and run style strikes into your opponent to just whittle them down and frustrate them over the game without taking too much damage back in return. Finally, just before we get to the manifestations, we have the Khainite Shadowstalkers, which is the Warcry warband. They are 9 models for 110 points, so you are looking at roughly 12 points per model. With 1 health and a 5 up save, they aren't exactly tanky, but they can do some sneaky movement tricks. They've got a little bit of range with their cursed missiles, which are 10 inches, but noticeably okay, thanks to 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage. But then in melee, they are quite a bit worse. They've got 2 attacks each with 3s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage. So that isn't going to do much. But where they are good is that they have the Shadow Leap rule, so they can just jump around the board in your movement phase and be set up again 9 inches from enemies to grab objectives or threaten enemy backlines or just drop nearby to do some shooting into a small chaff unit that you might want to get rid of. So they are not bad, and they can certainly use their abilities to come onto the board, kill a few models, and then steal a key objective, which does of course win you games. Finally, we have the manifestations, and they do all look awesome. The Bloodrack Viper is up first with a solid 10-inch move and some relatively scary melee. It only hits on 4s, but then 3 attacks that are 2s to wound with -1 rend and +1 rend against heroes, and that do 3 damage and have the crit mortals ability. It can be really scary. It can also put strike last onto an enemy hero, an enemy infantry hero should I say, on a 3+ thanks to its rampage. So this is a great anti-hero piece. It will on average do about 3 damage to a 3-up save hero, which may not kill them, but it could very well finish them off if they are striking last and you have another unit in combat with them. Bladewind is up next and is apparently an absolute nightmare to put together in terms of model wise, but again it is quite good. It's a speedy 12-inch move, but quite flimsy with only 7 health and a 6-up save, but it can again help you debuff an enemy with unnatural edge. This lets you pick an enemy and roll a dice, and on a 3+, they can't get any positive save modifiers against this thing's attack, so no benefit from things like all-out defense. And then in melee, it is 9 attacks on 3s and 3s with 1 rend, 1 damage, and the crit 2 hits rule. So on average, this will get you around 7 or 8 hits, and then kill off around 3 or 4 4-up save 1 health infantry. So it is a good anti-chaff, anti-light infantry killer. Finally, we have the Heart of Fury. This can't move, but it does have a decent 4-up save and 6-up ward to protect its 7 health, and it has a very, very nice effect. It makes your infantry units -1 to be wounded when they are wholly within 12 inches of it. So popping this down around a huge combat in the middle of the board will help to keep all of your squishy infantry that much safer, and will make it really quite difficult for your enemy to push through a good amount of wounds into them, which is great considering most of your stuff has fairly poor saves, so the less saves you have to make, the better. All in all, I do like the Daughters of Khaine. I think they are definitely a glass cannon, but they can hit very hard. And as I found out this past weekend, they really can hit very, very hard. And as the game progresses, they do just get stronger and stronger and faster and faster. I think Morathi is a great god hero, and there is also a load of really fun and powerful synergy and buffing potential that you can put together. You can get things like your witch elves to nigh on 80 attacks that they can throw twice, all at some really good hit, wound, rend, and damage. So it is definitely an army that you can play around with to catch your enemy by surprise. But as always, what do you make of the followers of Morathi? Let me know which of the formations you like the most, as well as any of your favourite combos from the various buffs you can do down in the comments below. As always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.